Alright, pushers, it's another episode of Mr. BAP US History. This time it's hammering out a Federal Republic, 1787 to 1820. In this episode, we're talking about George Washington's presidency. He did a lot of presidential precedents, including creating a cabinet, whom he appointed Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. On his first report to the public credit, Alexander Hamilton said, "To justify and preserve their confidence, to promote the increasing respectability of the American name, to answer the calls of justice, to restore landed property to its due value, to furnish new resources both to agriculture and commerce, to cement more closely the union of the states, to add to their security against foreign attack, to establish public order on the basis of an upright and liberal policy. These are the great and invaluable ends to be secured by a proper and adequate provision at the present period for the support of public credit." On to the notes. The Federalists implement the Constitution. In the first ever national elections, the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1789. Under the new U.S. Constitution, there is an executive branch. That executive branch is led up by the president. So the first ever presidential elections are 1788 and 1789. The Federalists won a majority in Congress, and George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. John Adams came in second and therefore became the vice president. Both of these would be considered as Federalists, although George Washington did not claim a political party himself. Washington appointed a cabinet which was not in the Constitution, but a cabinet is a group of advisors to run the executive departments. He appointed some very, 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 very important people, including Secretary of State, who was in charge of foreign relations. That would be none other than Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of War, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph as the Attorney General, who led up the Department of Justice. Speaking of the Department of Justice, the Judiciary Act of 1789 established federal district courts in each state's 3 circuits courts and the Supreme Court, which had 9 justices and still does have 9 justices in the Supreme Court. As the Federalists had promised to the Anti-Federalists, a Bill of Rights was written by James Madison and approved and added to the Constitution in 1791. This Bill of Rights, also known as the First 10 Amendments to the Constitution, the Federalists kept their promises, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and freedom to petition for redress of grievance. That's all in the First Amendment. The right to bear arms, the Second Amendment. No illegal searches and seizures, the Fourth Amendment. No self-incrimination, the Fifth Amendment. And the right to a speedy public trial by a jury of your peers, being the Sixth Amendment. There are some other ones too, but they're mostly unimportant. Maybe the 10th Amendment being important, to being the Reserve Power Clause, which says any power that not is given granted specifically to the federal government is reserved to the states and to the people. 10th Amendment. You might want to write that one down. Hamilton's financial plan. As Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton was tasked with coming up with a plan to fix the economy because the new country was broke. So they came up with a 3-part plan to fix the financial problems. Number 1, he filed a report on public credit, which we read at the beginning of this episode, or read one sentence. The plan: redeem at face value all money owed to foreign and domestic investors. So funded it at par. Assume the state debts. Create a permanent national debt. Alexander Hamilton is sometimes called the father of the national debt. Assume war debts of the states. These plans favored the rich. Virginia had already paid its debts, so Hamilton compromised by agreeing to build a new capital city in Virginia, also known as Washington, D.C. later on. Part 2 of the secret plan, not so secret plan. Part 2 of the plan, Bank of the United States, 1790, chartered for 20 years, provided economic stability. Jefferson argued that the bank was unconstitutional because it was not in the Constitution. This would be a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Hamilton argued that the bank was constitutional because it was not prohibited by the Constitution, which is called the loose interpretation. Citing Article 1, Section 8, the necessary and proper clause, also known as the elastic clause. Washington agrees with Hamilton and the bank is approved. This difference becomes the basis of the first 2 political parties, Hamilton's Federalists versus Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. So, disagreeing on interpreting the Constitution, fundamental difference between the first 2 political parties. More on that later. Number 3, the third part of the economic plan. Report on manufacturers propose an excise tax on luxury goods, including whiskey, and higher revenue tariffs on imports to make payments to the newly created national debt. To summarize, create a national debt, pay off national debt by using excise taxes and higher revenue tariffs, put your money in a Bank of the United States. Jefferson's agrarian vision. Hamilton's manufacturing and trade and banking vision of the United States did not go well with Jefferson's agrarian vision, agrarian meaning farmer. Jefferson was a leader of the Democratic Republicans. He spoke for Southern planters and Western farmers who thought that America should be a farming country, not a manufacturing and trading and banking country. This democratic vision for America was a society of independent yeoman farmers. Turmoil in Europe boosts agriculture output and profits. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, divides Americans. The French Revolution is the overthrow of the French monarchy, the Jacobins' reign of terror, liberty, égalité, fraternité, as they say in French. George Washington issues the Proclamation of Neutrality, even though the French had come in clutch after the Battle of Saratoga and helped America win its independence. George Washington refuses to get involved in the resulting war between England and France. This is the Proclamation of Neutrality, 1793. This allows American merchants to trade with both countries and is very profitable and keeps the United States out of the war. The Whiskey Rebellion, 1794. Western Pennsylvania farmers refused to pay Hamilton's excise taxes and attacked tax collectors. Classic. George Washington, as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, gets on his horse and leads a militia force of 12,000 men to crush the rebellion. The laws will be enforced under the new, strong central government created by the U.S. Constitution. Jay's Treaty, 1795. The British Navy seized American ships carrying French sugar as part of Britain's military strategy. George Washington sends John Jay to England to negotiate a treaty. Jay's Treaty accepts British right to stop neutral ships and required U.S. to pay compensation for pre-Revolutionary War debt. Very British, a very poor treaty. Not his best work right there. The Haitian Revolution, 1798-1803. Toussaint Louverture leads black Haitians to overthrow the government and slavery and create the first black republic in the Atlantic world. This raised fears of slaves uprising in the southern states. Washington sent aid to the white population. John Adams aided the black rebels. Very confusing foreign policy here. And Jefferson cut off aid to the rebels again and imposed an embargo and refused to recognize Haiti as an independent nation. So, we can see that the different presidents had different responses to the Haitian Revolution, depending on how they viewed slavery. The rise of political parties. The first party system, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. The Federalists are for a strong central government, promoted manufacturing and trade. For Hamilton's economic plan, they were led by Alexander Hamilton, who was their chief supporter, but also John Adams. They favored a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They favored merchants, creditors, wheat exporting slave owners on the Atlantic coast, very pro-British, and they mostly were concentrated in the northern and eastern parts of the United States. And as we said earlier, the leaders, Hamilton and John Adams. Again, George Washington was probably a Federalist, but he refused to claim a political party, saying that political parties were bad for the United States. The Democratic Republicans, for strong state governments, promoted agriculture, farming, strict interpretation of the Constitution, against the National Bank, against tariff, against taxes, pro-French, Southern tobacco and rice planters, Western farmers, immigrants, subsistence yeoman farmers, taking up residence in the southern and western parts of the United States. Their famous leaders were Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The election of 1793. The election of 1796. First elections with political parties. Jefferson versus John Adams. After serving two terms, George Washington steps down, creating the two-term tradition as a precedent that would not be broken all the way until the 32nd president of the United States. Jefferson versus John Adams. John Adams wins and continues Hamilton's pro-British policies. For example, the XIYZ affair, undeclared war with France, 1797 to 1788. The French minister demands bribes. The U.S. honor is insulted. U.S. cuts off trade with France and authorizes privateering or pirating. Privateering. The Naturalization, Alien and Sedition Acts, 1798. Example of partisan politics. doing what is good for your political party rather than what is good for the country. To silence critics of the Federalist Party, these were created. 3 coercive laws limiting individual rights. The Nationalization Act, resident required goes up from 5 years to 14 years, making it harder for immigrants to get voting rights. The Alien Act, deportation of foreigners. Both of these things are targeting the immigrants who mostly support the Democratic Republicans. And probably the worstest, the Sedition Act prohibited the publication of insults on the president or members of Congress. This unconstitutionally limits the First Amendment and used to imprison Democratic Republican newspaper editors. This makes people very, very upset. The Democratic Republicans responded with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which set forth the states' rights interpretation of the Constitution, asserting that the states had the right to judge if a national law was legitimate or not. Based on the compact theory of government, states created the federal government and therefore our superior argued the states could, quote, nullify a federal law, which would be an issue that would not be settled until the Civil War. This is enough notes for today's A-Pushers. There's a lot. Hope you appreciate it. Make sure you like, subscribe, and add. Long episode today. Don't give up. We can do this. Until next time, Mr. B, AP US History. Adios.